So huge thank you to Professor Andrew O'Shaughnessy for giving not one but two lectures, which takes quite a lot of doing, I know. And now we have Geoff Hicks, who has also been on my podcast. Not that I'm giving a plug to myself, but we did a podcast on the 14th Earl of Derby, which is called Tribute, and it's really interesting. I listen to it again and again, but it is really interesting, so I would suggest it's on my podcast platform, which is called the Countess of Derby. And Dr. Geoffrey Hicks was on the podcast as well. He's also been on my earlier podcast for Living History. And he's Associate Professor of Modern British History at the University of East Anglia. He's published widely on British political history and foreign policy, and is co-convener of Politics Before Democracy, a conference on political history held at UEA. Among his publications are Peace, War and Party Politics, The Conservatives of Europe, 1846 to 59, and Documents on Conservative Foreign Policy, 1852 to 1878. He's currently working on a biography of Lord Malmesbury, long-term political lieutenant of the 14th Earl of Derby. So I'll hand over to Geoff.
Lovely, thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do today is a very broad overview of the 14th Earl's later political career. I've interpreted later as starting with the first of his three premierships. And I'm going to work through his political life from 1852 through until 1868 when he retires. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of take us on a kind of history helicopter ride. We're going to hover along, and we're going to go down various points and try and cover what I can. Obviously, it's an immensely rich political life, and we can't cover everything, but I will do my best to cover at least the key aspects, and also to try and pick up on some of the points that have been made earlier. On that note, two important things to say before we get to where we get to in 1852. Derby had started his political life as a Whig, as has been mentioned, but of course he is best remembered actually as a Conservative Prime Minister. And the first of the important points I want to make is that it's really Derby who steers the Conservative Party and keeps it together for the middle of the 19th century. He's still the longest serving leader of the Conservative Party in modern times, 20 years leader of the more than 20 years leader of the Conservative Party. And it is really very much a personal loyalty to him that holds the party together through a tremendously turbulent time in the 1840s in particular and into the 1850s. We don't have time to go into the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, but I need to mention it at least briefly so that we understand the significance of it for Derby's career. Sir Robert Peel, in 1846, had decided to repeal the protectionist Corn Laws, the tariffs that kept the price of foreign imported corn artificially high and which benefited agricultural producers in Britain. Now, while Derby, I'm going to call him Derby, he's been Stanley until this point, but he's Derby in my period for most of it. While he understood the economic rationale for this, he objected strongly to the fact that Peel had stood in 1841 as leader of a party that was committed to protectionism. Now, he had started his life as a Whig, he had drifted more centrally, and he had become part of the Conservative government that had been formed in 41 under Peel. And then he had parted company from Peel over this question of economic reform. And in 1846, when Peel takes the final step of repealing the Corn Laws, which is seen as a great betrayal by a large chunk of the Conservative Party, it's Derby, he's still Stanley at this point, but I'll call him Derby, where it's Derby who takes on the mantle of leadership of the party. So from this point on, it is very much around his personal leadership that the rump of the Conservative Party coalesces. They lose, and this is important for something I'm going to say in a moment, they lose a lot of good people in 1846 because a lot of the brightest and best hopes of the Conservative Party, men like William Gladstone, stick with Robert Peel. And they go off and become known as the Peelites. There is a great schism in the Conservative Party that really keeps the Conservative Party out of power for a very long time, and certainly out of majority government for a long time. More of that in a moment. But it's Derby who keeps the party together. So there's a huge personal loyalty to him amongst the Conservatives. His great lieutenant, of course, Benjamin Disraeli, whom you will all have heard of, is very much a showman and is central to his political activities, but it's not Disraeli the party's loyal to. It's Derby. And it's only much, much later, by the time Disraeli has proved himself over 2 decades and has helped deliver the Second Reform Act, that the party's more or less ready to accept him as Prime Minister when Derby retires. But that would not have been clear 10 years earlier. Sorry, that's a very long point, but the important point is that Derby keeps the Conservative Party together. It's his great achievement, and it's one that Angus Hawkins talked about in his biography, and he talks about how he goes about doing that. The other point to make about Derby was that although you might think, oh, he's opposed to change because he's opposed to repeal of the Corn Laws, he's opposed to economic reform, that's absolutely not the way to see Derby. And one of the things I was struck by in the talks before the break was Derby's willingness to appreciate and understand the necessity for change. And he talks, Andrew mentioned the Knowsley Creed, which is a famous speech that he makes while he's still a Whig, but he's drifting away from the Whigs in late 1834. And he talks then, and he uses the language of the Industrial Revolution, he talks about the machine must keep going. The machine must go forward. He accepts the necessity for the Reform Act of 1832, and he accepts that there may have to be changes to come in the future. So he's not an ultra, he's not opposed to change. It is about how you deliver it and how you do so effectively that is important for him. And indeed, when he first becomes Prime Minister, he talks about the fact that a Conservative government is not necessarily a stationary government. So in other words, it's not standing still. It's capable of reform and change. And certainly his career as Prime Minister exemplifies that. OK, so those sort of 2 broad points then. Holds the Conservative Party together, not opposed to change. Moving on to what happens, and I'm going to move through his political life in chronological order. In 1852, the Whig government of Lord John Russell collapsed for reasons we don't need to go into. And it became clear that the only viable alternative government would be Derby leading a protectionist government, where he would attempt to try and deliver some kind of protectionist economic policy. That economic policy fails and falls at a general election. But for about 10 brief months, Derby holds the premiership in a minority government. So they don't have a parliamentary majority, but they are the party most able to form a stable government for those 10 months. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about that government. This is known to history as the Who ministry, as some of you might know. It's called that because the elderly, deaf Duke of Wellington was sitting in the House of Lords when someone was telling him the names of the ministers. And he'd never heard of any of them because, of course, all those brightest and best people had gone off with Peel into the political wilderness, or ultimately actually to join the Whigs in the end, many of them. And he'd never heard of who half these people were. And in any case, he was deaf, so he kept very loudly, and the whole of the house could hear him. He kept saying, Who? And hence it is known to history as the Who ministry. Formed, as I say, in February 1852, it pursues a protectionist economic policy. I put here, but more from political necessity than ideology. The important thing that Derby intuitively understands is that if you need people to accept reform, you have to move them there gradually. And you have to demonstrate that the alternatives don't work. And he knows that at one level Peel is right, that the economic reforms that Peel has piloted are probably the ones that the party's going to have to pursue. But he can't do that. It's really important. He can't do that until it has been proven demonstrably that there is not public support for a protectionist policy. And so that is what is a protectionist economic policy is put before the country. The Conservatives do not get a majority in the general election that's held in the summer of 1852. They then meet Parliament again. It was a little different then, so you didn't automatically leave power. It's not like today where, the removal van turns up at number 10 the minute the election is lost. Not quite like that. The outgoing government, what was probably going to be the outgoing government, met Parliament and put their proposals to Parliament, and then they would, if they were defeated, then they would leave office in due course, which is what happens over a period of months in the latter part of 1852. Disraeli puts these economic measures before Parliament, and inevitably, having lost the general election, they don't have enough MPs and they lose the vote. In one of the great parliamentary debates of the 19th century, when Gladstone talks for hours and hours and hours, which must have been quite tedious, but anyway, it is apparently a brilliant speech, and he takes Disraeli's budget to pieces. But the important thing I think about Derby is that appreciation that you have to deliver reform in a manageable way. And I think it's one of the reasons, I was very struck by the point you were making about the sort of the sharp distinction between the way in which Derby had dealt with slavery and then what happens in America, is that appreciation of how to achieve change without that kind of dramatic fissure in politics. And of course he's partly defined by his horror at what Peel had done in 1846 and over the 1840s. This, by the way, in case you're wondering, I'm sure many of you know anyway, is the young, rather glamorous Benjamin Disraeli, who is Chancellor of the Exchequer in Derby's first government in 1852. I want to talk a little bit about the foreign policy of the government as well as the domestic and economic policy, partly because foreign policy is my bag, partly because I'm writing a biography of this man, also looking rather glamorous, the third Earl of Malmesbury, who is Derby's lieutenant throughout his political career. They're shooting buddies. They bond really politically over resistance to the Reform Act, the repeal of the Corn Laws. And it becomes a very strong partnership thereafter. It's really striking, actually. Often there is tension in government between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary over foreign policy. And in fact, the 15th Earl of Derby, the eldest son of the 14th Earl, would of course dramatically fall out with Disraeli in 1878 over the Great Eastern Crisis. But by contrast, Derby's three ministries are characterised by great concord between the occupant of number 10 and the occupant of the Foreign Office. In the first two ministries, it was this man, Malmesbury. And the Conservatives perform actually a very important function for Europe in 1852, because this is the point where the new ruler of France, the President of the Second Republic, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the great Napoleon of Waterloo, he's become President of the Second Republic, and he's about to declare himself Emperor Napoleon III, as he becomes. This is a great crisis for Europe because the other great powers of Europe were pledged never to let a Bonaparte sit on the throne of France again. So how on earth, they've got an alliance to that effect. So how are they going to deal with it? What the Conservatives are able to do, and it's a wonderful partnership between this man, Malmesbury, who's a personal friend of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. The two men had met while Malmesbury is on his own grand tour back in the 1820s, which is also a rather fun one. Sadly, no journal, but lots of great letters. They had become friends. But the critical intervention actually comes from Derby late in 1852. And he writes this brilliant dispatch, which goes on for page after page after page. And I've seen the notes, and it's more or less in one go. There's hardly a change in it, where he sets out the reasons why Britain is able to accept a French empire led by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and also why Europe can be calm about that. And it is effective. There's a lot more detail to that, but the important thing is that what Derby and Malmesbury between them do is effectively persuade the other great powers of Europe this isn't as bad as it looks. They solve the crisis. So they're only in power for 10 months, but they help resolve a really quite significant European crisis over this, which, by the way, is not really properly explored in a lot of the literature even now. While they're in office, they also restore relations with Austria, whom the Whigs had fallen out with. Austria, very important Central European power in this period, not the little rump country that we know and love for our tourism today. Also works closely in cooperation with Russia over the other end of Europe. Not because there is any conservative fellow feeling. It's not because there's any sense in which, these are reactionaries and we ought to support. Not at all. This is about ensuring stability and calm in Europe as best they could. Now you might think, well, that's obvious. Of course, that's what a government would be doing, but it's not actually, because this is the era of Viscount Palmerston, more of him in a moment, who is the rumbustious foreign secretary, he of gunboat diplomacy in the 1830s, 1840s and into the 1850s. So actually the calm that Derby's government brings for those 10 months is very welcome around the capitals of Europe. So that's the government of 1852. There's more we could say, but as I say, my helicopter is hovering for a bit, and now we're going to move the helicopter on. They go out of power in December 1852, and a new government is formed, the Aberdeen coalition. Now this is under Peel's old deputy, who had been Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Aberdeen. Here he is in the middle. Aberdeen had become the flag bearer of Peelite conservatism because Peel himself was dead. He'd been thrown from his horse in 1850 and never recovered from the blow and died shortly thereafter. So the flame of Peelite politics is kept alive by the Earl of Aberdeen and his protege, Mr. Gladstone, who becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer in this government. And it brings the Whigs and the Peelites together. This is a very confusing period in terms of party loyalties. My students find this thoroughly frustrating, and we go through some lectures where I say, right, now we have one government, now we have another one, now we have another one, now we have another one, and I'm afraid it's a bit like that. But what we're going through is a sea change in British politics. We are gradually getting an alignment of the sort of moderate conservative forces represented by the Peelites with the Whigs. In 1859, this will become the Liberal Party. So we get the creation of the modern Liberal Party, which of course is the forerunner of the Liberal Democrats as we know them now. Meanwhile, Derby is busily keeping the Conservative Party together. A lot of Derby's role in this period is about keeping the troops' morale up in long periods of opposition, because essentially the Whigs and the Peelites have a majority. So he never has. Derby is, I believe, he's the only Prime Minister that never actually has a majority at any time in his tenures as Prime Minister. And that's a huge political task to manage without the parliamentary support. And so he's busy keeping things going. Now, fortunately for the opponents of this coalition, it doesn't prove a very steady one because while they all get on domestic policy, they don't get on in terms of foreign policy. There's lots of people who've been Foreign Secretary. At one point, there are 5 people who've been Foreign Secretary in this cabinet. And they all have different ideas about how to deal with foreign policy, and they fall out very badly over how to deal with Russia and the potential threat of Russia in the east, which is what leads up to the Crimean War, which breaks out in 1854. And I have to say, I've got some sympathy with the Tsar on this one, because he is utterly confused by the mixed messages that come out of number 10, out of this coalition government. Because sometimes the Palmerston wing, the kind of strong men, the gunboat wing would come out on top and they'd take a firm line, and sometimes the Doves under Aberdeen would come out, and the mixed messages are very, very confusing. And it's a point that Derby and Malmesbury make very effectively in opposition. They say you needed to take one policy and pursue it clearly and thoroughly, and then you could achieve peace, which of course is what they had done. So, 1854, we go into the Crimean War. This is, as some of you, perhaps many of you will know, is a dreadful mess. It's begun with a failure of diplomacy. It's the first media war, so it's a war when we have photographs, when we have correspondents reporting on events at the front that come into the newspapers, within hours and suddenly within days. They're on the news, they're on the breakfast tables of Victorian Britain, and they see in very great detail the failures. There's no censorship. The failures of the British Army. There are failures of supply, failures of medical care, and then the army fails. It fails to win victories, but neither Balaclava nor Inkerman, the 2 great battles, achieve what they should have done. And this generates a committee of inquiry in 1855 into the course of the war. And the question is this an opportunity to form a government? But Derby is a consummate political operator, and he recognises in 1855 that he can't form a government because he doesn't critically have the support of one particular man. He doesn't have the support of Palmerston, and he recognises how Palmerston has become significant for the political firmament. And one of Derby's great skills, and this may already have come across, I hope it has, is that he's a realist. He works with the reality of politics, and he appreciates the necessity for compromise, but he also recognises the realities, the limits on political operations. So he declines to form a government in 1855. This leads to some tension with some of his own supporters. Disraeli is not very happy, actually, that there hadn't been a government formed, and there are periodic tensions between the 2 men. Again, though, important to stress that Derby remains the man in whom the party reposes their confidence. And there are lots of these people they call the country gentlemen, who are the sort of the backbench MPs, tend to be landowners, agriculturalists. They tend to come from the county shires, and they are the people who prop the Conservative Party up at Westminster. And they look to Derby. He provides the authority and the guidance. He's one of the great sort of political leaders of the mid-19th century, one of the 19th century, and it's still somewhat frustrating, I think, to those of us who work on him to find that people are still sometimes, well, who knows the 14th Earl of Derby? Anyway, so he declines the opportunity in 1855. And we move into a period where Palmerston, here he is, Viscount Palmerston, he becomes Prime Minister. It's recognised that he is the only man who can scrape together enough support to sustain a government. And I would say, really, in this little middle bit of the 19th century, the 2 great political geniuses in Britain are Palmerston and Derby. They're both very clever political operators, and they both keep their political combinations together very, very effectively. In this period, it is Palmerston who is successful. What Derby has recognised from the outset is that he will only be able to establish a successful government and some kind of future for the Conservative Party if his enemies, his opposition, fall out with one another. And so he has to wait. More of that in a moment, because it's a very important strategy which Angus Hawkins talks about in his biography. I should say, by the way, that Angus was a mentor to a lot of us who worked in this field, and his work in 2007-8, his 2-volume biography of the 14th Earl, changes the historiographical landscape, the landscape of the literature. And we all miss him a lot. But it was great to hear about him again just now. But Derby has to wait for them to fall out. And sure enough, in 1858, as a result of a crisis that I will not go into, in early 1858, that essentially comes out of how strictly Britain should respond to objections from France about a terrorist outrage that has been plotted by Italian revolutionaries in Britain. That already sounds pretty complicated, and it is. But the important thing is that Palmerston appears to be giving in to French demands, and he's hoist with his own petard because he'd taken this sort of strongman gunboat diplomacy line for many years, and then when he looks as if he's appeasing the French, his friends desert him. And Derby, to his own surprise, finds himself with an opportunity in February 1858. He's up in the gallery watching the Commons. He, of course, is in the Lords. He's watching what's going on in the Commons, and he sends the message, this is a chance, vote against. And sure enough, they managed to dislodge Palmerston, who had appeared triumphant. And so Derby is back as Prime Minister. Forms another minority government, February 1858. February is an important month in the political life of the 14th Earl of Derby. This lasts for rather longer, lasts for about 18 months, comes in February 58, only goes out in the summer of 1859. He is... It's responsible for a number of important acts. Something I haven't put on there is he has to deal with the aftermath of the what was known at the time as the Indian Mutiny, has become subsequently known as the Indian Rebellion, has various different names. But it is Derby, and it is his son, the 15th Earl, who becomes the first Secretary of State for India and has responsibility for drawing up a lot of the legislation dealing with the new government of India. And I'm sure that those earlier travels and his experience as colonial secretary helped to inform the resolution of that situation. They have to pick up the pieces that have been left them by the previous government. Also, for those of you who may have heard of the Chartists, who had their 6 demands, radical demands about change in Britain back in the 1830s and 40s. It is actually Derby's government, during Derby's government in 1858, that the first of the Chartist demands are met. That's not the reason why Derby meets them, but it is the Property Qualification Act. It's no longer required for MPs to own a certain amount of property to take office. I come back to that point that was made there were resonances in your papers earlier, and that I was making, which is he recognises the importance of the necessity for change. If you're going to ensure that there's not revolution, that there's not turbulent disorder, then you've got to make concessions, but you do them in a managed, efficient manner. And I'm not going to dwell on the Jews Relief Act of 1858 because Lady Derby has set out very, very clearly what it did. But we've commented on the importance of that in enabling Jews to take up their seats in Parliament. So this is, you might think, and this is exactly what Derby says. He said, don't expect this to be a stationary government. This is a government ready to act and to change where necessary. They even tried to deliver a reform bill in the early part of 1859. But they get caught up partly on the details of that, partly in the tumult that surrounds the outbreak of war between Austria and France, which I'm not going to go into, and they do quite well in the general election in 1859, but yet again they fail to get quite enough seats to form a government. So this comes on to strategy for. So we come on to the strategy for opposition. I talked about Derby understanding the need to wait for his opponents to fall apart. He appreciates that there's a whole big range of people on the other side. There's Peelites, there's radicals, there's Whigs, but there's a very big difference between aristocratic Whigs on the one hand and radical merchants on the other, who are all sort of bunged together in this big tent. And he realises it's going to fall apart sooner or later. So he has what he calls his strategy of masterly inactivity, which is you wait, you prod where you can, and you wait for the edifice to fall down. Don't give your enemies the opportunity to unite against you, because they'll all agree they don't like Derby and the Conservatives. Don't give them that opportunity where you can avoid it. So he tries to work with Palmerston to stop Russell, who's his deputy by this stage, pursuing reform, because if there's going to be any reform, he wants to ensure it's done in a way the Conservatives would want. He gets Malmesbury secretly to negotiate a deal with Palmerston that basically they're going to prop the government up and stop the radicals getting their way. And then when opportunities come along, as over the Schleswig-Holstein question, which you will be relieved to know I'm not going to talk about in any detail, this is the one that Palmerston famously says, only 3 people in the world understood it. The Prince Consort who's dead, a German professor who's mad, and me, and I've forgotten it. So I'm not going to try and do it, but there's an opportunity to oppose the government on this, which they take. They come within a whisker of ousting the government, but the Queen is very loath to lose Palmerston, the stability that represents, and they rather pull their punches in the end. But they take the opportunities where they can. And we're moving into an end of an era here, another shift in politics. Prince Albert dies in 1861, a whole series of prominent politicians. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm not going to read them all out. And then the great event that everyone had thought might happen for a long time, but no one had quite known when it would. October 1865, Palmerston dies. This completely transforms the political landscape in Britain, because it means it is likely that Russell and more radical Whigs will end up running the Liberal, what has now become the Liberal Party. As Philip Goodalla says in his biography long ago, the last candle of the 18th century went out. So what's going to happen about reform? And in the last part of the lecture, I just want to move on to the question of reform, because I suppose really that's the greatest of the domestic political legacies of the 14th Earl. Reform has not gone away as a question. There had been a Reform Act in 1832, the so-called Great Reform Act of 1832. But by 1866, there was significant pressure for more reform. These 2 organisations were agitating for change, the National Reform Union, the Reform League, and then there were major riots in Hyde Park. Crowds poured in, a mob pulled up the railings in Hyde Park, created all kinds of chaos. It was very clear that there was a clamouring demand for more people to be given the vote and for the electoral system to be made fit for the late 19th century in various respects. In this, there is a political opportunity for Derby, which he is not slow to spot. Gladstone and the Liberals are still in power, so Palmerston's dead. The Conservatives don't automatically come in when Palmerston dies. Russell forms a government. Gladstone is effectively the great mover and shaker of the government. And he comes up with a Liberal bill. Now, the problem with it is that it doesn't go far enough to satisfy the radicals, and it does anger the more conservative Whigs, the more moderate Whigs. And Derby and Disraeli very skillfully exploit the divisions in Whig ranks, and they work with the so-called Cave of Adullam, biblical reference to the opponents of reform, the Adullamites, and with them, they force the abandonment of the Liberal Bill, and Russell gives up in disgust, and the Whig government, the Liberal government, resign in 1866, which brings Derby back for the third and last time. So, why deal with reform? The Conservatives are keen to end the controversy about reform. They want to control the process. Derby recognises there might be a fantastic opportunity in this. This could be the Conservatives' opportunity to build themselves back into a winning electoral force. He's absolutely right, and he is vindicated in this later. You can split the Liberal Party. Well, that's a definite win. And what they decide to do is design a measure that appears radical, but has as conservative an effect as possible. Has a conservative effect as possible. I will not go into the details of the Conservative bill in all its glory, especially with lunch not too far off. But it gives a greater measure of household suffrage. In other words, more people get the vote. There are safeguards built in. He has to make compromises at one point, and comes up with a thing called the 10-minute bill, so called because it's agreed in 10 minutes before Parliament meets. But he, despite making compromises, it still prompts the resignation of 3 of his ministers who are opposed to reform. And so actually the party says, well, in that case, if they've gone, we'll proceed with the measures pretty much as intended. And what I am compressing a very complex and long parliamentary process into a few minutes. There is a long campaign, but what Derby in the Lords and Malmesbury with him and Disraeli in the Commons deliver is the Second Reform Act, which is a Conservative Reform Act. It adds 1 million more voters to the electoral register. Now here's an example of a man who certainly sees the machine going forward, going back to that Knowsley Creed in 1834. 1 million's a lot in the context of the electoral system of Victorian Britain. Working class voters become a majority in the big cities. You think, gosh, Conservative leader delivering this in the 19th century. Yeah, but hang on just a moment. Just think about what those constituencies are like. They're almost all Liberal constituencies anyway, so who cares if they've got massive majorities? Doesn't matter. In the counties, the vote is extended. It doesn't matter about the precise details of this, but the vote is extended to people who own property, but not as extensively as some of those who previously had the vote. So the £5 property owners and the £12 householders. What's this all about? What it's about is that the Conservatives have recognised that these are quite moderate Conservative voters. So although you're extending the vote, it's essentially extending it to safe suburban middle-class voters. So it's a very neat move. You give an extra seat to Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds and Birmingham. Well, they can have an extra seat. That's not going to make too much difference. And indeed, some of them might vote Conservative. So not necessarily a bad thing. Suburban areas are hiked away from the counties, solid Conservative areas, tacked onto the boroughs, like I say, build those mountains of Liberal votes up. Who cares? It doesn't matter. And thousands of voters are moved from the counties to the towns. So this is a very cleverly constructed act. On the one hand, it gives lots more people the vote, and people from lots of different classes. But actually it's designed in such a way ultimately to deliver something that will be valuable to the Conservatives. He calls it in the speech that delivers it a leap in the dark. And what it delivers immediately in 1868 is a Liberal victory. And it looks like nothing's been achieved. I think one of the great ironies and great sadnesses of the 14th Earl's life is that he doesn't live to see that he was right. Because what happens, he dies in 1869. In 1874, precisely the logic of what he had done is vindicated, because in 1874, Disraeli delivers a massive general election victory, but he does it on the back of Derby's reform bill that he had helped to deliver. He's helped to construct a Conservative majority. Disraeli's majority comes from Derby's patient political work. He also paves the way for a change in the way parties operate, so the kind of rise of popular politics stems from the Second Reform Act, not necessarily his intention, but certainly its effect. And parties change very dramatically over the coming years as they have to adapt to a greater electorate and be more responsive to them. So the modern party system owes a great deal to the groundwork laid by Derby, though I'm sure he'd be horrified by some of the subsequent developments. I think perhaps this is his greatest domestic political legacy, though there are an awful lot of others. At that point, I'm going to turn my helicopter off. Thank you very much.